Today, I'm going to talk about 6 harmful foods that can feed disease and can lead to dementia. The first one is ultra processed foods. The second one are foods with added sugar. The third one are foods with a lot of salt, high sodium. The fourth one are foods that can injure your gums and cause gingivitis. The fifth one is alcohol. The sixth one is highly fatty foods. Are you ready? We're going to dive in. All right, here it goes. First, let's go ahead and define what is dementia. Now, most of us probably think of dementia as Alzheimer's disease, maybe. Well, Alzheimer's is a kind of dementia, but dementia itself is a whole spectrum of different types of brain conditions where our brain is not functioning normally. So you could have impaired intellectual function, you can have problems with cognition, which is thinking, memory, the ability to do complex tasks or complex analysis, and interference with your social skills, which actually requires brain power as well, obviously. And dementia can actually be the result from a huge number of health conditions, and it can also be kind of a brain-only problem. So this is actually not one thing, it's a lot of different things. And to some extent, dementia is sort of like a final common pathway of brain compromise, all right? So now that you know that, you got to think about what are the symptoms of dementia. Well, the ones that you might suspect are in fact important symptoms, like poor memory, all right? Usually the person with dementia doesn't realize that they have poor memory. It's usually other people who are around them that notice that their memory is actually impaired. That's important to know. Another symptom is confusion, disorientation, right? So when you actually see people that, kind of don't seem to be aware of their surroundings, they may not be oriented to person, space, or time, or they might just be a little confused about things. That's another kind of warning sign. There's even more subtle signs, like, for example, someone who has trouble planning or coordinating activities. Now, there's a lot of people I know who actually have trouble planning and coordinating activities, but this is sort of, think about a change from what you would normally know this person to be able to do. So somebody who's normally, quite together and with it, able to plan and coordinate things, suddenly the next time you see them, they're like having problems doing it, all right? And by the way, that planning isn't necessarily a complex vacation or a wedding or anything complicated like that. Even planning meals can actually be difficult. What are you going to have for lunch? What are you going to have for dinner? And these are conversations that come up naturally between people. And usually it's somebody in the family or a friend who notices that there's difficulty in coordinating. All right. Even basic tasks, all right, like going out to run an errand, could be actually difficult for someone with early onset dementia. Now, simple tasks could be affected, but certainly complex tasks are affected by dementia. Something like managing your finances, paying bills, but even simple things like tying shoes can be challenging. All right. What do I do next? Those kinds of things are one sign of dementia. Now, remember, I told you there's a lot of different causes of dementia. These are sort of the final common pathways, these kinds of things that you might actually notice. Problems with logic or reasoning, all right? Somebody comes up with an explanation for something that just doesn't make any sense at all, that's a symptom. People who get lost easily, all right? Because remember I told you, they're not oriented. Maybe they're not oriented to space or time or location. So it's all out of whack. And so if they're driving a car, maybe they get lost. If they take a walk out in their own neighborhood, they may have been living there for 20 or 30 or 40 years, they don't quite know exactly how to get back to their house. That's another warning sign. And of course, difficulty in communicating, word finding trouble. Now, we all have a little bit of that, from time to time, but this is sort of a repeated pattern that seems noticeable and unusual. And so these are the many different kinds of not so subtle, but also can be subtle signs and symptoms that something is actually not quite right with the brain. All right. So dementia is always involving the brain, but it could be other things that are going on in the body that do affect the brain as well. All right. Some people with dementia actually have personality changes. So they could be super irritated or they get angry easily. And again, these are things that they might not actually appreciate, but people around them appreciate. Or they might be depressed or appear depressed. They could be anxious. People with dementia can actually be quite anxious for the reasons like they're confused and disoriented or frustrated and they can't actually remember words or solve a task. They can even get agitated or even paranoid. All right. So those are also things to look out for. Some people with dementia actually have inappropriate behavior. So, you can draw your own conclusion to what that is. There's a big, long range of inappropriate behaviors, touching or speaking in certain ways, using certain language, but anything that seems out of character and inappropriate behavior-wise could be a sign of dementia. Hallucinations, seeing or hearing things that aren't there. That's also one of the things that can happen. Now, look, all of these signs and symptoms can come from other things as well, but I'm giving you kind of a big picture. You can kind of see these are brain disorders or brain problems that are either emanating from the brain itself or other physical things are happening that can actually affect the brain and how well it functions. Now, so if you take a look at what actually is going on in the brain, all right, because it is actually happening in the brain. And one thing is problems with nerves. Now, the brain is a complex organ. It is made of billions of neurons, millions and millions of neurons, all right, that are all having to communicate to each other. Your brain has two halves, the left half and the right half. It sits in your skull. There's a hindbrain, which actually is where sits right next to your spinal cord. And then your spinal cord goes right down into your spine, down the middle of a hole in your spine. And that's how you actually function. Oh, by the way, your eyes. Boop, your eyes actually connect right into your brain. In fact, the eyes are kind of a window into the brain. So one type of dementia can occur when there's abnormal proteins that are deposited in the brain. Proteins that maybe they're like in the background, but then there's a lot of that protein that's there. For example, these would be the amyloid plaques that you see in the tangles that you see in Alzheimer's disease. The other thing that can actually cause dementia are hardening or narrowing of the blood vessels that are feeding your brain cells, your neurons, all right? Now, you may have heard me talk about this before, but the human body has 60,000 miles worth of blood vessels packed inside us. That's a lot, but guess what? The human brain, your brain has 400 miles of that, and it's actually all blood vessels that are feeding your brain. Now, not surprisingly, to run a complex organ like the brain, you need a lot of circulation. You need a lot of blood flow. You need a lot of oxygen, right? So the oxygen that we breathe and the nutrients that we eat all pass through these blood vessels that are the highways and byways of the brain to deliver those nutrients, deliver that oxygen to those brain cells, all right? Those neurons. Now, what can happen when your blood vessels get hardened or they get narrowed for blockages, atherosclerosis, plaques narrowing the blood vessels, including the small blood vessels, then the blood flow gets reduced. And when you don't have as much blood flow in your body, including your brain, then the nerve cells in your brain become relatively starved of oxygen and nutrients, and they start to malfunction, right? So that's called vascular dementia. Vascular because it has to do with the blood vessels. And one of the signs of vascular dementia is actually slowed thinking and the inability to focus or problem solve, all right? And by the way, for vascular dementia, that's what you see mostly. Slow thinking and inability to focus or solve a problem. That's much more common than the memory loss that you see in Alzheimer's disease. So these different types of dementia have different characteristics, and you see more of one sign or symptom in one type of dementia versus the other. Then there's Lewy body dementia, which is a pretty common type of dementia where there are clumps of Lewy body proteins. Remember, I told you these are proteins that shouldn't be there, but then kind of like gather up into these big clumps in the brain. And Lewy body dementia is another cause of dementia, in addition to vascular dementia and Alzheimer's disease. And by the way, these Lewy body clumps are also seen in another neurological condition called Parkinson's disease. Now, most people with Parkinson's disease, which is a movement disorder, right? People are actually tremoring, shaking. That's Parkinson's disease. Michael J. Fox has Parkinson's disease. That's a movement disorder. But eventually, because of these proteins, we think the Lewy body proteins that accumulate in the brain of Parkinson's patients, they will develop dementia as well. All right. So we talked about Alzheimer's. We talked about vascular dementia. We talked about Lewy body dementia. We talked about dementia that ultimately emerges in Parkinson's disease. And then there's frontotemporal dementia. Okay, frontotemporal dementia, you might have heard about this. Bruce Willis has it. This is the breakdown of the neurons in the frontal, right here, and the temporal. That's both sides on the side of your brain. Okay, the side lobes of the brain. And these are breakdown of the neurons in the areas of your brain that control personality, that control behavior, and control language as well. Now, obviously, if you have breakdown of the nerve functioning, brain function of personality, behavior, and language, it's going to lead to a noticeable problem. And that is frontotemporal dementia. So based on what I've told you so far, dementia is pretty complex, right? Okay. Now, we in the medical community, and I'm speaking as a doctor, we don't have a complete understanding of these dementias and what causes them. And we have incomplete treatments for them as well, which is why it's so important to try to prevent them if you can, and also but also to recognize which things can actually make the increase the risk, which is what we're finding out from research. And eventually, we'll actually find more effective ways to actually treat the brain disorders that lead to dementia as well. But until that time, let me say that we do know that diet and lifestyle plays a big role. All right. So I'm going to tell you about foods that you actually need to know about and what they can actually do and what we think they do to actually contribute to dementia. Food number one, the first food I want to talk about is a class of foods called ultra processed foods, or UPFs. All right. And ultra processed foods have been making a lot of news recently because of the fact that the research is just stacking now to be pretty incontrovertible, meaning convincing, that people who eat a lot of ultra processed foods have a higher risk of all forms, many, many different types of chronic diseases: diabetes, obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, autoimmune conditions. I mean, the list goes on and on. But it turns out to be linked to a higher risk of dementia as well. So what are ultra processed foods? These are foods that are made in a factory, where the factory takes ingredients and starts to change the makeup of the ingredients to create a form of the food that doesn't naturally occur in nature. All right. So I like to give an example of when you were a kid, you might have eaten these animal crackers. I can tell you that wheat doesn't come in the form of circus animals, like little crackers, right? So that's an example where a factory took a raw ingredient that's whole food, plant-based, like wheat, and then molded it, extruded it, shaped it into something that isn't really how the food would normally appear. Then ultra-processed foods will additionally put additives into that food product. Could be a preservative, usually is a preservative. Could be artificial flavoring. Could be artificial coloring, all right? And they put them into the product, so these products will actually last a long time, and they are engineered to be tasty. So you can put all kinds of chemicals in to make the food highly desirable. And this is part of the food industry. And I know the food industry gets a lot of flack for it, but I would argue that that's what they're in the business to do. So they're doing a good job. What we need to do as consumers is to recognize that consuming ultra-processed foods can have many negative health consequences, and one of them is increasing the risk for dementia. All right. So let me just kind of give you some data on this. There was a study by researchers at the Sao Paulo Medical School in Brazil, and they were looking at the eating habits of a lot of adults. In fact, 11,000 adults over 8 years, and then they looked at their cognitive skills. And what these researchers found is that those people, among those 11,000 adults who ate the most ultra processed foods, again, these are foods that I'm sure we've all have them in our pantry. We grew up eating them. Chips and snacks and junk food comes in a box, comes in a bag, comes in a can, comes in a jar, filled with really interesting colors and flavors. The stuff you see on advertising on television, for example. Those people who ate the most ultra processed foods had a 28% faster accelerated decline over the course of 8 years in their cognitive test score. So basically, they were seeing how people performed on thinking tests, cognitive tests, and they found that those who actually were eating a lot of ultra processed food had a 28% faster decline over the period of time. All right. So what are the cognitive skills that they saw declining? Memory, the ability to use words, all right, phonation, and ability to plan. We all plan our day. Can you imagine if you didn't if you were struggling with how you plan your day, all right, just like basic stuff, and difficulty executing goals, all right? So these are the things they were looking at: memory, ability to use words, ability to plan, and ability to execute to achieve a goal. And they compared this with people who ate low amounts of ultra processed foods, all right? And they found, again, higher decline in cognitive ability based on more ultra processed foods being eaten.
Hey there, check this out. I've got a resource on the 10 foods to improve your cholesterol, and it's free. Hey, not all cholesterol is created equal, so in this resource, I explain why maintaining a healthy balance of LDL, that's low density lipoprotein, and HDL, high density lipoprotein, is crucial for your cardiovascular health. And I tell you about the foods that you can add to your diet to help make this happen. My resource, it's yours right now for free in the caption below. All you have to do is click on the link below the video. And now back to the other video.
Now, there was another study that showed the harmful effect of eating ultra-processed foods, and they found that the harm was strongest in the people who were eating a lot of these ultra-processed foods between the ages of 35 and 60. Now, let me kind of give you some context of why this study matters. By the time you're noticing dementia, it's usually in people who are older, right? So in their late 60s, 70s, 80s, etc. That's where we tend to think dementia is more common, and in fact it is. But it turns out that that later problem with dementia was worse, more striking in people who were eating a ton of junk food, ultra-processed foods between the ages of 35 and 60. Now those are the super vibrant years, right? Like basically you're in the middle of adulthood, having a job, and the reason that this is important is that it shows you how important it is to cut down or cut out the ultra-processed foods earlier in life. Don't wait until you have dementia or somebody tells you have dementia before you go, oh man, okay, I quit now. It's really important when you're young and healthy and vibrant between the ages of 35 and 60, right? To really cut them down, all right? Because ultimately later on, if you eat a lot, that's what this one study actually showed, that it actually puts you at a higher risk later, years, decades down the line. So one of the questions that you're probably asking as well, so how do these ultra-processed foods affect the brain? Like, why are they so bad? And we don't have a full understanding of this. I'm a scientist, and you always know you're talking to a real scientist when somebody says that they're not really sure, they don't have the full answer, because scientists spend most of their time, like when I'm with my scientific colleagues, we spend most of our time talking about what we don't know, not what we know. So we don't have a full understanding of how ultra-processed foods affects the brain, but we do know that the brain consumes up about 20% of the body's energy to function. So it's got a high metabolic activity, and most of that fuel, that energy, comes from the food that we eat. So just like, if you think about your brain and your body like a car, right? You're going to be filling up the car with fuel at the gas station. Well, when we eat our food, that's actually filling up our body with energy. And that energy, by the way, gets stored in muscle, fat, and liver. Your fat cells, in fact, specifically are fuel tanks. And I wrote about this in my book, Eat to Beat Your Diet. Got it right here. If you're interested in how body fat works, check this book out. But we're talking about the brain now, all right? And this is an area that I'm doing research on now. The key is that if you're filling up the car with gas, fuel, you really want to choose the highest quality fuel. Now, it's okay if you occasionally you put the low quality fuel in your car's going to be able to take it. You won't notice it, all right? But if you continuously, consistently, week in and week out, month after month, year after year, all you're doing is putting poor quality fuel into your car. It's not going to run as long or as well as a car of somebody who actually takes care of actually putting high quality fuel into their car. And that's how it works with food and the brain as well. When we actually eat foods that are poor quality in terms of foods, like ultra processed foods, that's like putting poor quality fuel into our body, and the brain gets affected. Now, we've all grown up eating junk food. I'm sure you have as well. I mean, think about it. Like at school, the schools actually serve snacks that are not good for you. You go to a sports event. What do? You're buying junk food. Or a movie. I can't tell you how scary it is to eat movie theater popcorn with that fake butter that they put on it. All right, these are all artificially contrived foods, poor quality fuel. All right, now do it once in a while, you're going to be fine. Your body will bounce right back. It's called resiliency. Our body's really hardwired to be quite resilient, but you do it frequently, maybe constantly, and you're not actually eating the good quality foods. All right, so you're eating mostly ultra processed foods, which is pretty common actually, and you're not eating the good quality whole foods, whole plant-based foods, you're going to be in trouble. It's like putting poor quality fuel in your car, for the life of the car. It's just not going to run as well. So what should you do? The healthy foods are whole plant-based foods containing fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds or legumes, right? These would be beans and peas and things like that. Herbs and spices, all right? These are and healthy oils. So this is sort of like the healthy traditional Mediterranean diet. That's what they eat there, right? And the Asian diet, they don't really eat olive oil in Asia, but a lot of the other similar whole plant-based foods are the ingredients for the traditional diets, which are known to be the healthiest diets around the world. And these same diets are actually good for the brain, all right? Good for the rest of the body, but we're talking about dementia, Mediterranean diet, traditional Mediterranean diet, and traditional Asian diets that are largely plant-based and with a lot of dietary fiber, good for the brain, all right? So here's the thing. I'm not telling you to swear off ultra-processed foods and never buy any. You're gonna be eating them once in a while, all right? Even me, just wandering through life. I can talk about principles, but I like to also recognize that we're humans, so we have to live a real life. And every now and then, you just grab something and it's an ultra processed food. So the key thing is not to, just swear off them. I mean, if you can do it, that's fine. But more realistically, what you want to do is to reduce your intake whenever possible. So I very rarely eat ultra processed foods. Occasionally I do, but mostly I'm putting high quality fuel in my body. So here are my 3 sort of tips for you on how to actually counter the harms of ultra processed foods. So first, eat more whole plant-based foods and buy the ingredients yourself so you know where they're coming from. Buy the highest quality ingredients and cook them yourself. This is actually what they do in traditional healthy Asian households and in the Mediterranean traditionally. Now you know where everything is and where it comes from because you bought it, and now you're actually preparing it yourself. There's no guesswork. There's nothing that comes out of a box and you're not really sure what's in it, all right? So if you eat more of those whole plant-based foods that you cook yourself, you're gonna have less room for ultra-processed foods. More good stuff leaves less room for the bad stuff. That's my first tip. My second tip is actually read the ingredient label when you buy anything that's not fresh. Okay, so just step into a grocery store and you're trying to figure out, is this an ultra processed food or not? All right, pick it up And just quickly look at the ingredient label. It's on every single food. It's mandated by law. And take a look at it, and if it's got a long list of ingredients, and as you get into the ingredients, you can't pronounce them, you don't know what the role of it is. Like, listen, I mean, I'm a scientist and I don't understand what the role of some of these additives are in when I read an ingredient label. But when you see that, that just set off a red flag in your head. This is probably an ultra processed food. You don't know what's in it. You don't feel comfortable putting it into your body, and don't buy it. All right. In fact, this is actually a good practice in a grocery store. Then go look for another product nearby on the same shelf or in the same area. Pick it up and make sure that the ingredients label don't show those unusual things that you don't know what they do in your body. All right. So never hesitate to put back something that you don't recognize as good for you. All right. Third tip, I want you to cut down or cut out snacking. Now, snacking is sort of very natural, right? Like when you were kids, we were given snacks at snack time, like at school or summer camp or whatever it is. But as we got older, like we would be sneaking snacks or just grabbing a snack when we were at home, right? And then we develop these habits when we're adults where we're just reaching and just munching on things. And, when you're eating, when you're distracted, that's not very good because you're often not mindfully choosing the foods that are actually good for you. Now, most snack foods are ultra processed foods, all right? So that should just tell you right there. If you're reaching for a bag of whatever, that's a snack, that's probably ultra processed. So cut those down, cut those out, and you'll be eliminating ultra processed or lowering ultra processed food from your diet. And that actually will lower the risk for brain consequences, including dementia. All right. Now, the next food I want to talk about that can feed disease and lead to dementia is any food or beverage that contains a lot of added sugar and you're eating a lot of it regularly. All right. So, look, we all have a sweet tooth. I got a sweet tooth. All right. And when I was a kid, I couldn't wait for Halloween. You get all this candy in front of you, or go to the proverbial kid in a candy store. I remember that exact feeling. But here's the thing that we now know when it comes to your health. Super sweet foods where the sweetness is because sugar has been added to the food. Sodas, juices, candies, factory-made cookies and cakes. These are the things that a sweet tooth would have. These types of foods are not only ultra processed, they come out of a factory, but oftentimes they're also empty calories. Now, let me explain to you what that means. Empty calories means is you get calories. I mean, you get a lot of sugar, all right, but not a lot of the other stuff that can be healthy in food, like polyphenols, like dietary fiber. Like you would get that, like you might have a piece of candy that is apple flavored, all right, and it's just sugar added to it. So you're going to get a big glucose dump, which, we live off of glucose. But the thing is that it's missing what would be in a real apple, which contains polyphenols like chlorogenic acid, and it contains the ursolic acid in its skin, and it contains dietary fiber. So all of these other things, the polyphenols, the dietary fiber, they activate our body's health defenses, which I wrote about in my book, Eat to Beat Disease. I'm just showing you, if you want to learn all about the body's health defenses, check out that book. So the whole food always gives you more than just sugar sweetened stuff. Now, sugar sweetened things are not only ultra processed, but they give you this huge metabolic load of sugar, and that's calories, right? So I remember I told you, when you're eating food, you're putting fuel in your body. It's just like going to the gas station with your car, you're putting gasoline in. How do you measure gasoline? As gallons or maybe liters if you're in Europe. In food, we call the measure of the energy of the fuel we're putting into our body, we call it calories. Very simple. If you actually consume too many calories, you're going to overwhelm your metabolic machinery because your body then has to store those extra calories in fat cells. All right. And when there's too many calories you're taking in, your body fat's going to increase in size because you're going to keep loading more fuel into the fuel tank. That's a fat cell, also called an adipocyte. And so you have a lot of sugar. You're going to be loading up another fat cell and another fat cell and another fat cell. Oh, man, there's still so much sugar. Let's go ahead and create new fat cells, and then they're going to expand, and then another fat cell, and it's going to expand, so on and so forth. And you can kind of see your fuel tanks in your body, your fat cells are just going to get bigger because it's storing a lot of energy. All right. This is basically why eating a lot of sugar actually leads to weight gain. Now, the other thing that happens is that when your fat cells actually start to accumulate and get bigger and bigger and bigger, all right, this actually causes inflammation. And the reason it causes inflammation is because that fat mass, all right, has to live off its own blood supply. And when it starts growing bigger and bigger and bigger, it's kind of like a tumor. It outgrows its own regular blood supply. And now parts of the mound of fat is actually starved of oxygen on the inside, like areas just doesn't have enough blood flow to be able to sustain it. And that's called hypoxia, all right? Hypoxia. It's an important term to know about because hypoxia is a setup for all kinds of things, heart attack, stroke. But in the case of your body fat, hypoxia stimulates inflammation. And when your fat gets inflamed, guess what? That inflammation derails a lot of the hormonal patterns that are coming from your fat, going to your brain, signaling to figure out how to actually control your blood sugar. It wreaks havoc, okay? The analogy that I give is that if you've ever been to a symphony, they're playing classical music like Beethoven's Fifth, right? It's a really grand piece of music composition. And there's all these musicians and a conductor, and everything is being played according to the music, and everything's coordinated together. That's your body fat normally orchestrating your metabolism because your body fat releases a hormone called adiponectin, and adiponectin collaborates with insulin to bring in that blood sugar into your muscles and store it into your fat and even to your liver. You need that adiponectin in order for insulin sensitivity. But with inflammation, it's like a gang of rowdy thugs breaking into a symphony hall during the performance of Beethoven's Fifth, storming the stage and kicking over the instruments. You've created chaos. And now this symphony that normally plays perfectly together, coordinated, no longer coordinated. Some of the instruments on the ground, and adiponectin is one of those instruments. And when adiponectin is derailed, all right, because of inflammation, guess what? It can't collaborate with insulin to help insulin bring in blood sugar. And now you've got insulin resistance, and insulin resistance and inflammation can be caused by eating a lot of excess added sugar, all right? And then what happens with insulin resistance, then your blood sugars are going to rise. You're still eating more sugar. It's going to keep on rising, and your body's unable to absorb or process or store the sugar that you're eating more and more of because of insulin resistance. Now, this is actually the setup to a problem called metabolic syndrome, all right? And that metabolic syndrome, if you get that puts you on the road towards type 2 diabetes. You see? So look, having a soda, having a fruit juice, or having a donut or piece of cake or something, some candy, that's not going to give you metabolic syndrome right away. But if you're actually constantly eating this stuff and constantly having added sugar, this is actually what's going to set you on that road towards badness. All right. And by the way, that metabolic syndrome leading to type 2 diabetes, guess what? People with type 2 diabetes are more prone to developing dementia. So you can say that some people believe that dementia is actually a metabolic disease. Well, I think that's true. If you have metabolic syndrome and your body's metabolism is upset, that can affect your brain. By the way, diabetes, type 2 diabetes, is also linked to a higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. And because diabetes damages blood vessels, the lining of the blood vessels is called the endothelial lining. When you've got type 2 diabetes for many years, the lining of your blood vessels becomes sickly. It's not normal. And you can actually form narrowing more quickly in the blood vessels. And remember, when you got narrowing in the blood vessels in your brain, those 400 miles worth of blood vessels, guess what? That's vascular dementia, right? So diabetes is a setup for all this, and eating a lot of added sugar and ultra processed foods that actually lead you to metabolic syndrome and lead you to type 2 diabetes. I'm talking about over the course of years, right? Okay, this kind of diet and lifestyle and the pattern of eating over years actually can lead you towards the path of dementia. Now, the other kind of blood vessel area that gets damaged that can be very, very harmful is the blood-brain barrier. Now, for those of you who don't know what the blood-brain barrier is, we got our circulation in our whole body, and the same blood that's pumping out of our heart, into your kidneys actually gets up into the brain as well. And the key thing, though, is that Mother Nature designed our brain to have an extra filter. So if there's something really noxious running around, that extra filter will protect our brain from getting something bad into the brain. Well, guess what? When you have metabolic syndrome that progresses to type 2 diabetes, which can occur when you're actually having a poor diet and a ton of extra added sugar as one of the many things that you're not doing yourself a favor by eating, then that filter called the blood-brain barrier, which are just specialized blood vessel, an area of specialized blood vessels, that breaks down. Now your filter's bad, all right, and now toxic substances can get into your brain. So that may well be one of the reasons why, with vascular damage, okay, over a long period of time from metabolic syndrome into type 2 diabetes, that may be why that diabetes actually increases your risk for different types of dementia as well, right? So how bad is this risk of type 2 diabetes? Well, this has been studied. It's type 2 diabetes is associated with a 50% increased risk of developing dementia. And by the way, that risk is kind of spread out unevenly with different populations. Turns out it's actually pretty high, even higher than 50% in certain groups like the Asian population. All right. Okay, so what's the solution to this problem? Well, pretty simple. Just watch your sugary foods. Like I said, we all have a sweet tooth. We're all drawn towards sweet things, but limit them. Limit them to an occasional treat only. And whenever possible, avoid factory-made sweets, whether it's a food or a candy or a cake or a beverage. Again, you can avoid all these things if you just pick up the package and read the ingredient label. And if sugar is like in the first 3 or 4, 5 lists, they have to, the way they list this, by the way, an ingredient label, in case you didn't know, they list the ingredients first that are present in the highest amounts. All right, that's how the ingredient label works. So when you see sugar way up there at the beginning, sugar and water, all right, like for a beverage, that's sugar sweetened. So I would watch out for that. And by the way, so the things to watch out for: sodas, sweetened fruit juices, commercial beverages that are sweetened that might have added sugar. Listen, even some healthy beverages, like orange juice is supposed to be healthy. Kombucha is supposed to be healthy. All right. But please, they're made in a factory. So please read the label. You might find that something good has something added into it that takes away some of the goodness. I call it 1 step forward, 2 steps back. You don't want to be doing that. And the best way to prevent that is by checking the ingredient label to see if it's sugar sweet when it comes to this. All right. Now, the next food that can feed disease and lead to dementia are super salty foods. Super salty foods. Now, super salty foods basically can lead to vascular dementia, which is damage to the blood vessels and therefore damages the brain. Let me explain it to you a little bit. Salt is very tasty. That's why if you go to a restaurant, if you ever go to an open kitchen, watch the chef who's preparing your meal. All right. If you have a sitting at the counter, maybe you're actually, at the chef's counter and you can actually see them cooking. Watch how much salt they put in their food. Most restaurants add a lot of salt into their food. Now, salt is critical for our health. We need salt in our body. In fact, our nerves, including the nerves in our brain, require sodium, salt, in order to be able to function. In fact, it's kind of an electrical current. But if you eat too much salt too often, what that's going to do is build up a lot of sodium in our blood, and high salt in the blood leads to blood vessel damage. All right. Now, I'm an expert in blood vessels. And one of the worst thing that can happen is you actually damage or rip up the lining of your blood vessels. So think about blood vessels like a garden hose. Inside the walls of your garden hose, all right, is a lining of cells. This is the lining of your blood vessels called the endothelial lining, and it's very thin. It's like a layer of plastic wrap inside blood vessels, and this plastic wrap is super slippery. All right, when it's in healthy position, when it's in a healthy state, it is slippery, like an ice skating rink after a Zamboni. You know, the polisher, ice polisher, cleans the ice, right? You can actually take a sweater, if you've ever been ice skating, throw it after the ice has been polished, and that sweater would just glide all the way across the end of the rink. Now, when the lining of the blood vessels is damaged, all right, now that smooth lining isn't smooth anymore. And guess what? Blood cells can stick to the lining, and that sticking to the lining can cause a blood clot. So what am I talking about? Let's go back to the skating rink. All right. So normal healthy blood vessels are like a skating rink after the Zamboni. The ice polisher has been driving through it. Super slick. Nothing's going to stick to it. In fact, that's why it's the most slippery ice. But after a hockey game or after a session where the public's been skating and all kinds of people have been skating with different skill sets, all right, what happens to the ice? It's damaged. The surface of the ice is damaged. It's rough, right? Needs to be cleaned. But when an ice is really rough, you throw that sweater on it, it's not going to go very far. It's going to stick to the ragged ice surface and stay there. And when that happens in the blood vessels, when you've got damage to the lining of the blood vessels, it's like damaging the surface of the ice in an ice skating rink. Now you can stand the chance of actually having blood cells stick there and forming a blood clot. And blood clots in blood vessels heading to the brain or in the brain, that is a big disaster, frankly. And when the clots are big enough, you wind up having a stroke, right? And strokes are a common cause of brain damage. It's a cardiovascular disease, all right? And that's actually something that you want to avoid. So high salt diet actually can damage the lining of blood vessels. Now, there's another thing that can happen with high salt in your diet, all right, and that can cause dementia. That's by causing hypertension, all right, and make your blood vessels in your brain, remember the 400 miles, it can make them really stiff, okay, and hard. Now, high salt leads to hypertension, all right, and high blood pressure leads to hardening of the arteries in the brain, and then this is linked to vascular dementia, one of those dementias that we talked about at the very, very beginning. And of course, hardening of the arteries can also lead to a stroke. And if you have a stroke, you're going to be killing some brain cells. Some brain cells are going to die, right? And at any stage in life, we want to keep as many brain cells around and active as we possibly can, all right? So what's the numerical risk of hypertension, high blood pressure, and dementia? Well, this has been studied. And one study out of Australia had researchers looking at 34,500 people. That's a lot of people. And these people are all participants in different clinical studies, clinical trials. In fact, there were 17 clinical studies altogether. So this particular study out of Australia is what they call a meta-analysis. So that's a detailed statistical study and integration across the findings, the results from many, many different studies, right? To say, all right, did we find something or not? Well, what they found is that people with untreated high blood pressure were 42% more likely, higher risk of developing dementia compared to healthy people. Let me repeat that. People with high blood pressure that's not treated have a 42% increased risk for developing dementia compared to healthy people. And if you were properly treated for high blood pressure, the risk was a little bit lower, so it was 26% elevated compared to untreated high blood pressure, which is 42% elevated. So the mere fact you have high blood pressure puts you at risk. But if you don't treat your high blood pressure, you don't see a doctor, don't kind of get on top of your game. So you might need medication, but you certainly need to lower the salt in your diet, which is how we started this whole point. It puts you at super high risk for dementia. All right. So what's the solution to this? Pretty easy. Limit your salt intake. Go for the low sodium. If you're buying something, look for the low sodium version. If you're seasoning your food, put the seasoning in as you're cooking it. Don't put extra salt at your dinner table, that you might actually put some extra salt in it. All right. And when you're cooking, be gentle with the amount of salt you put in. All right. Less is more. You can always add more salt if you need it. All right, and taste it, but you can't take it out. You can't take the salt out. All right. And a little salty food every now and then is fine. All right. It's the regular consumption of very salty foods. Like if you eat out all the time, you're probably eating a lot of sodium. That's what does you in. All right. And by the way, the other way you can actually just kind of check yourself out to see if you have high blood pressure, which, it all by itself is a risk factor for dementia. One thing you do is just check your own blood pressure every now and then. All right. It's like weighing yourself on a scale. You can go to a drugstore now and buy an inexpensive battery powered blood pressure machine. All right. The same kind of batteries you'd put into a flashlight, and check to see if you have high blood pressure. Right. So, 120/70 is normal blood pressure. Once you get into 130s and 140s, the top number, and into the 80s and 90s, the bottom number, you're moving towards hypertension. All right. Now, nobody expects you to interpret your own blood pressure other than to know if it's consistently high. I always tell people, if you're going to take your blood pressure, write it down on a piece of paper like a diary, or write it into your calendar, or make a note of it in your phone. All right. And then you should see your doctor. Have a regular doctor's visit, and during the visit, even for a regular checkup, the nurse is going to take your blood pressure and weigh you, but you're going to get your blood pressure taken as a matter of routine. But if you record your own home blood pressures, that actually is probably a more accurate reflection of what your blood pressure really is, because everybody who goes to the doctor's office, your blood pressure is a little higher, just because people tend to get nervous when they're in the doctor's office. We call that the white coat syndrome. Blood pressure is always a little bit higher. But you know what? You might have been racing through traffic, or couldn't find parking, or didn't want to be late for the appointment, so you're rushing. All those things will raise your blood pressure also. That's why I say record your blood pressure. By the way, best way to take your blood pressure is to take it 3 times in a row. All right, and throw the first reading out. All right, and then see what the last 2 readings are. Record them. All right, and then you can show the doctor your blood pressure diary. That's super helpful to us when we're actually seeing a patient. All right. So the other thing, by lowering the amount of sodium, salt in your diet, it also helps to lower your risk of a heart attack, kidney disease, eye disease, many other conditions that you can avoid. All right. So again, this is just something to be mindful of. Don't eat a lot of salt. Okay. What's the 4th thing that puts you at risk for dementia? Well, gum disease, gingivitis. And research has shown that your gum health is linked to brain health. Now, this is a relatively new discovery just over the course of the last 10 years or so, but the evidence is getting clearer and clearer. So what is gingivitis? Gingivitis, the gingiva is your gums. Itis refers to inflammation. So gingivitis is an inflammation of the gums. And when your gums are inflamed, that really is starting to be tagged to many different diseases throughout the body, like heart disease and brain disease, like dementia. Once again, why does this happen? We don't really have an exact understanding of why it happens, but the evidence is starting to emerge that this may have to do with your oral microbiome. Now, you've heard of the microbiome in terms of gut microbiome, but guess what? Your gut starts with your mouth. It ends with your anus, and there's 40 feet in between there. But usually we think about our lower gut microbiome as our gut microbiome, but guess what? The oral microbiome, the gut microbiome in your mouth, on your tongue, on your teeth, growing along your gums, and on your palate, these healthy bacteria in your mouth actually have a function for health that we don't fully understand, but we think it's critical. The connections are critical of good oral health for microbiome to brain health. That's what we're actually beginning to see. Now, the healthy bacteria in your mouth, your oral microbiome, they are in the crevices of your gum, like like your big tooth sticking down with a root, right? Kind of like a stake in the ground, in your gum and into your gums. And there's a little divot that goes down into the root of the tooth. Look, the healthy bacteria are actually right there, and the gum is normally not inflamed. But when it gets inflamed, if you don't brush your teeth, if you have other kinds of infection in your mouth, man, your gums are inflamed, you might have bleeding going on there. And what we think is that when you have dysbiosis, that's a problem with a healthy gut microbiome. That's a setup for dementia.
Well, hello. If you're looking to take control of your health and you want to use food as medicine to optimize your health, then I invite you to check out my Eat to Beat Disease course. I personally developed all the materials. It is fully online and packed with practical, science-based strategies and everyday tips that you can start using right away to boost your body's natural defenses that protect your health and fight disease. So whether you're wanting to prevent a disease or overcome one, or whether you just want to feel your best, my Eat to Beat Disease course has everything you need to make powerful changes in your life. Learn more about it by clicking the link below.
And we do know that gut microbiome, healthy gut microbiome bacteria, lower inflammation, they produce short chain fatty acids that can promote healing, streamlines your metabolism, and we do know that the gut microbiome can signal to the brain. We've known that for years, all right? In fact, good healthy gut bacteria basically text message your brain to release social hormones. So there is this gut-brain connection, gut-brain axis that connects the entire length of your gut to your brain. We also know that healthy bacteria, one that I've done research on called Lactobacillus reuteri, L. reuteri, okay, we know that this bacteria definitely communicates with your brain and prompts your brain to release social hormones like oxytocin. Now, oxytocin is the social hormone that comes out of your brain that makes you feel pleasure, happiness. It's a very, very important thing. So we already know bacteria that's found in the gut can communicate to the brain. And we know that when your oral microbiome, the healthy gut bacteria in your mouth, is disturbed, all right, like with gingivitis, that disturbance, unhealthy oral microbiome, gut microbiome, actually is linked to dementia. All right. Okay. So this is something really, really important to know about. The link between gingivitis is particularly strong with Alzheimer's disease, and studies have been done. In people who have Alzheimer's disease, and they look in their gums, and they tend to have inflammation. And people who have gum disease but no Alzheimer's, they actually develop Alzheimer's much more commonly and faster than people who don't have gum disease. In fact, if you measure memory alone, people with gum disease have a faster, six-fold faster decline in their memory compared to people with Alzheimer's disease who have healthy gums. Let me say that again. People with Alzheimer's, all right, if they have healthy gums, their memory is going to decline a bit, over time because of their condition, their brain condition. But if they got gingivitis, inflammation of their gums, dysbiosis, unhealthy oral microbiome, their memory declines 6 times faster. All right. So what's the solution for this? Again, fairly straightforward. See a dentist regularly. Brush your teeth every single day. In fact, if you can brush your teeth every meal, that's even better. And floss. Flossing helps clean out the space between your teeth, and it can actually help remove food particles and prevent bacterial overgrowth, which can sometimes overgrow harmful bacteria, and now you've got that riot, that chaos that's going on in your mouth. All right. And by the way, flossing also stimulates your gums so that they're healthier as well. Okay, next food item linked to dementia and disease, alcohol. Now, this is kind of a no-brainer, literally. Okay, alcohol is a toxin, and it's a toxin that kills brain cells, period. I don't really need to give you another explanation to tell you that alcohol is a brain toxin, all right? But I will tell you that this has been studied, and one study from Korea looked at 3.9 million people. This is a monster study, and it showed that those people who had more than 5 to 7 drinks a week of alcohol, and that's like wine or beer, increases the risk of dementia. All right. So if you drink every day, every weekday, 7 days a week, every day, it increases your risk of dementia. And by the way, what this research study found was that if you increase your alcohol intake by even 1 drink, the risk of developing dementia goes up 8%. All right. 1 drink, 8%. All right. 2 drinks, 16%. 3 drinks, okay, 24%. And you can start seeing how this starts to add up. Now, alcohol also does kill brain cells, and it decreases the number of brain cells that are around. In fact, people who are heavy drinkers, if you take a look at their brain scans, you'll see their brain is actually shrunken. Okay, it's compared to people who are not drinkers. Now, alcohol also increases the accumulation of the protein that I mentioned earlier, beta amyloid plaque. It's part of the problem of Alzheimer's disease, right? You've heard of that, beta amyloid in Alzheimer's brains. Drinking alcohol speeds up the accumulation of these plaques, all right? And then, of course, there's the direct wholesale killing of brain cells. We used to call that alcoholic dementia. Now it's actually called alcohol-related brain damage, I think. But the point is this: alcohol, no amount of alcohol is actually good for the brain. All right. So the way you want to think about it is keep an eye on how much you drink. Keep the amount less than one drink a day. All right. If you're going to drink less than one drink a day. Avoid hard liquor at all costs because it's got more alcohol per drink. All right. And just be very, very careful when you take alcohol. Now, I want to explain my position on alcohol because alcohol, I believe, is part of human tradition. It's part of our humanity. In fact, humans started drinking like during the Stone Age, like 10,000 years ago, because when we started to grow grains, wheat, barley, later grapes, as soon as we started to grow these things, we started to ferment them. We meaning humans, all right, like in the Stone Age. And when you fermented these grains or grapes, it turns into alcohol, right? Ferments and it gives you alcohol. So we humans have evolved this pattern of drinking alcohol at special occasions, right? Key moments of our lives, weddings, funerals, birthdays, holidays, celebrations. So I kind of think this is my philosophy, all right? I don't have a problem with alcohol in terms of having a drink every now and then, because that's part of our humanity. It's part of human tradition. But if you want to be safe and avoid the potential health harms and brain harms associated with alcohol, what I would tell you is this: save your drinking for a special occasion. All right. Don't drink normally, but when there's a time to celebrate or recognize something, go ahead and you can have a drink, but never drink. Keep it down to one drink a day. I know it's hard, but keep it down to one drink. All right. And by the way, drink with people if you're going to drink. All right. Like, so as part of our humanity, don't drink alone. Drinking alone is a setup for actually alcoholism. All right. Enough said. All right. Another food. Let's talk about this. Eating foods that are high in fat is another risk factor for dementia. Now, why does this happen? We know there's a lot of health problems that can occur if you eat really fatty foods too often. Like you're going to get diabetes, type 2 diabetes. You can develop heart disease. You can have a higher risk of stroke and obesity. Dementia is just another consequence of eating a lot of fatty foods, right? So why the increased risk? I mean, we've always regarded, like the medical community, we've always regarded that eating a high-fat diet increases the risk of atherosclerosis. This is narrowing and hardening of the arteries. And I remember I told you when you actually have narrowing of your arteries, of your blood vessels, you get poor blood flow, and that can lead to vascular dementia, right? Blood vessel problems lead to vascular dementia. But there may be more going on than that, because researchers in Spain have looked in the lab for an explanation. And what they found is that lab animals that are fed a high-fat diet, all right, you can actually engineer chow, rat chow, mouse chow, to be really, really high fat. Okay, and when they feed these to the lab animals, the high fat diet, what they found is that the gene expression, the expression of the DNA, the creation of the proteins in the brain changed, and in fact, high fat diets change brain metabolism, change gene expression, change metabolism. In other words, eating a high fat diet affects your DNA in the way that it actually makes proteins. That's pretty profound, actually, right? So it's not just narrowing of the blood vessels, but in the brain itself, there are substantial changes at the DNA level. Now, another study from China looked at 8,630 people and found that diets that are high in saturated fats, that increases the risk of Alzheimer's disease by 39%. All right. High saturated fat diet increases risk of Alzheimer's disease, 39%. Way too high for me. So, and by the way, there was a dose response to that, meaning that for every 4 grams per day of extra saturated fat in a diet, there was a 15% higher risk of Alzheimer's disease. Every 4 grams of extra fat, 15% higher risk. And this was, a step up. So it's a dose response, right? More dose means more effect. All right. So this is really super, super important to think about, which is why I bring it up as one of the risk factors. Now, there's other studies that have been done recently. One actually that looked at data from the Nurses Health Study, and another one that looked at the Health Professional Follow-Up Study. And I can tell you that they found that for every 2 servings per week of processed red meat, which will have a lot of saturated fat, for every 2 servings per week, there was a 14% increase in decline, cognitive decline by 14% for every 2 servings of processed red meat. All right. By the way, so how do you translate that? That means that for every daily serving processed red meat, that adds another 1.6 years of aging, cognitive aging, to your brain, right? So you're actually increasing your chance of cognitive decline and speeding up the aging of your brain by eating fatty foods, specifically processed meat. All right. Now, by the way, the other thing that happens when you're eating every serving a day is that you're actually increasing by 1.7 years your cognitive aging when it comes to verbal memory. That's basically, your ability to actually use words, remember words, and the more processed meat you eat, the faster your brain ages in those particular fashion, right? Now, the good news is that when people swapped out red meat for nuts and legumes, in other words, they changed the saturated fat diet to a monounsaturated and a little bit of polyunsaturated fat diet with nuts and legumes, right? So that's taking meat-based diet and swapping it out for a plant-based diet. Okay, guess what? The risk of dementia dropped by 20%. So this is what I'm talking about. You can actually kind of finagle your risk and turn it up, turn it down by what you eat, the decisions you actually make. So what are some of the common sources of dietary saturated fat? Well, fatty cuts of red meat and processed meats. Unfortunately, fat in red meat tastes really good. That's why a ribeye steak is amazing tasting, or Wagyu. Anybody who's been hearing about Wagyu, Wagyu, it's originally a type of cow, a breed of cow that is really fatty, originally from Japan, super expensive. And now they're actually breeding Wagyu cows in other parts of the world. But if you actually compare, do this next time you're at a butcher and you can see if they have Wagyu, compare a normal piece of regular red meat, which does have saturated fat, all right, like go ask has a butcher to show a ribeye, and then ask them to show you the same cut, all right, of the Wagyu, and you will see like the red meat is red, regular meat's red. This one is pink because there's so much fat in it, lots of saturated fat. All right, processed meats will also have a lot of saturated fat. Salami, bologna, pepperoni, all those kinds of things will have a lot of saturated fat. Coconut oil is another source of saturated fat. So I know people talk about, the medium chain triglycerides and coconut oil. You know what? There's saturated fat in it. Everybody knows it. I'd cut it down. All right. It's just going to be better for your brain health. And of course, dairy products will have some saturated fat like cheese and butter and milk and cream, ice cream, those kinds of things. And baked goods, usually factory made cakes and cookies, are going to have a lot of saturated fat in your diet. So just be careful about it. So what's the solution to this? Limit the amount of red meat and dairy that you eat. Just limit it. All right. And cut out processed red meats, deli meats, hot dogs, jerky. All right. By the way, these processed meats also are considered by the World Health Organization as a class 1 carcinogen. They increase your risk of cancer. So you might as well cut that out anyway. All right. And what you do is you switch to a mostly plant-based diet. Take out the meat or cut down to the meat and swap it up for plant-based diets. I'm telling you, you can take certain kind of mushrooms and grill them, and they taste a lot like steak. The proteins, and people say, well, I need my protein from red meat. No, you don't. Actually, legumes, chickpeas, tree nuts, they're a great source of dietary protein. So there's no problem with doing that. So if you're going to eat meat or dairy, what I would suggest, use them as a condiment, not as the main. All right. And by the way, of course, look at the ingredient label of anything you're buying, like baked goods, and look for ones with less saturated fat. It usually lists what the amount of saturated and unsaturated fats as well. All right. And when it comes to actual fats and oils, switch from butter to extra virgin olive oil, right? Extra virgin olive oil that contains polyunsaturated fatty acids, a little bit of omega-3s, and it is rich with healthy polyphenols that can actually help to improve your brain health and lower your risk of dementia. So that's for your brain alone, and to kind of try to lower your risk of dementia. Extra virgin olive oil is the way to go. What's the reason? Well, it's got these polyphenols that are super antioxidant, lower inflammation, improve your metabolism, and they actually improve brain health. They're called like hydroxytyrosol and oleocanthal. Those are found in extra virgin olive oil. So use EVOO, extra virgin olive oil, instead of coconut oil and butter, because those are sources of saturated fat. All right. We went through a lot. I hope you learned something new from this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time at the next video.
Hi there. If you enjoyed watching this video, I know you'll love the next one. Stay here and check it out, and I'll see you there.